Now, JavaScript's original intention was for it to manipulate HTML pages. But at the moment, all we've been doing is we've been shifting data around in memory in terms of the JIT-compiler. Now, this is very important. You need to be able to manipulate data and store data in a functional manner so that you can end up manipulating the DOM. So we need to, first of all, learn the basic data set, which we've already done. We've looked at objects, arrays, variables, and so forth, and how to do the verbs, the actions, such as functions and for loops and other conditional functions. But now it's time to take that data and produce it onto a web page. Now, the first thing we must learn is the document object. This is one of the most important objects in JavaScript. So the first thing I want to do is open up my console window that's going to talk to the JIT-compiler, and we want to take a look at that document object. Now, what is the document object and why do we need it in JavaScript? Well, the document object has everything to do with your HTML. Your HTML is quite simply a raw data file. What you are doing is you are essentially creating an XML document. There's nothing special about HTML, it's just simply raw data. The special part comes in where JavaScript actually interprets the DOM, or the document object model. And notice what it says, document object. The emphasis here is on the object. So you are creating a document and it's full of objects, and you are modeling that document based on those objects. Hence the name document object model. You are creating a structure in HTML. Now, the magic doesn't come just with HTML on its own. HTML is ultimately the absolute raw data to the user. The special part also comes in with CSS that styles the DOM, and then also you have the JavaScript JIT-compiler that wants to communicate and manipulate the document object model, or the DOM. So whenever we refer to the DOM, we are talking about the HTML. That's all it is. But how do all these things communicate together? For example, in JavaScript, you can manipulate the object itself. You can add text into that object. For example, let's go ahead and say edit as HTML. I can say in JavaScript, go grab the body tags. And what I want you to do is create a div element in those body tags. And don't forget that your object right here can have attributes. So JavaScript also needs to know about those attributes, such as the ID, the identifier for this object, this element. And I could just call it hello. And also what we can do is we can have CSS attached to this div element right here, and even to the body tags as well. So how does JavaScript keep track of everything? How does it keep track of the document object model? And don't forget that model may change due to JavaScript. So how does JavaScript keep track of, let's say, styles that are applied to this element, either through the DOM via the style attribute, or the styles that come from, let's say, an external CSS file? On top of that, it'll also need to note some more information, such as the attribute information. So, for example, the ID, classes applied to this element. And also, what does this element contain? Text? Does it contain other DOM elements? And how would that represent and look in JavaScript? Well, without you noticing, even if I didn't load in any JavaScript files whatsoever, JavaScript, the JIT-compiler, will look at the HTML page that is being created. Now, we know it creates the window object with all of the JavaScript API, but what it also does is it creates a document object. So now we're going from the DOM object, so we can see DOM objects right here are very simple, very plain, but JavaScript objects that represent DOM elements, such as a div element, the body element, and so forth, they have a lot more detail and information about that DOM element. And so if I go to the console window, and then we want to call up the window object, we know that the window object is the root level object, and that symbolizes the browser's window or tab in this case. So now that we have this, what I can go ahead and do is call up the window object. Now we have the window reference. It contains all of the JavaScript APIs, the default functions that you can run. However, it also contains a document. Now, whether you have any JavaScript files loading into this page or whatnot, as long as the JavaScript compiler is enabled in the browser, which most browsers do, it will automatically create a document object. And we can take a look at this document object, and it's attached directly onto the window object. So if I scroll down, you will notice there it is. There's the document object. And this is a JavaScript representation of the DOM. Now what I'd like to do is just inspect this on its own and forget about all of the other properties and methods on the window object. So one way I could do this is to go up, and don't forget that the document object is directly located on the window object. So it is globally accessible. I can just type in document. Now this does something a little strange, and the console window just starts printing out what looks like to be regular HTML. And you're thinking, well, that's regular HTML. There's nothing really special here. Now it didn't just copy and paste the DOM text. That's not what JavaScript did. It actually interpreted the DOM and converted it into a load of JavaScript objects. But if you just type in document directly, this is usually what you'll get. Or if you try to fetch an individual element in JavaScript, you'll usually just get the text back that looks like HTML, even though we're not working with HTML. So this is a little bit deceptive. So how do I get the true representation? Well, you can either go through the window object, or what you can do is to just look at this document object on its own in its true form in JavaScript, type in dir, and this will allow you to print out or display an interactive list, which means give me what this looks like in JavaScript, and I can then pass in document. Now when I do this, it will then give me the object. That's what I wanted, and this is what the document object looks like in JavaScript. So all we're doing by the dir function is simply saying, look, give me this right here without interpreting it. So don't give me sort of HTML text and your interpretation of the document object. You're telling the console, just give me the JavaScript object that represents the DOM. So can you see how JavaScript works? You have the window object, which is in JavaScript an object, and that window object represents the tab or browser window that's open. And likewise with the DOM that we have here, it interprets it into JavaScript again by taking that DOM and interpreting it into a load of JavaScript objects. So JavaScript represents things in object form. Now likewise, I can go ahead and just take a look at the document itself. I have, let's say, the URL. I can look at the active element, which is the body element. That's very interesting. You also have the body property. Now, don't forget the document is representing the entire DOM right here. It's representing the HTML, the head, and all the rest of these elements. However, we also have the body, and most of the time you're going to be working with the body element. That's where your DOM elements are rendered to the user, so you'll mostly be working with DOM elements inside of the body and the body itself. So we can take a look at the body element, and if we take a look at the body element, again, it's an object. It's an interpretation from the DOM into JavaScript, and it produces another object to resemble that DOM element. And if I take a look at this, we now have a JavaScript object that represents a DOM element, which is the body element. And it gives me a whole host of information. So you can scan through and sort of have a look at all of this information. But things that are interesting are child nodes and children, and you have a class list, for example. So if your element had the class attribute, you can have several classes on the body element, and each one of those classes will be represented in an array. Don't forget, when you see these square brackets, you must note that you are working with an array, and the giveaway is when you open it up and you see the length property. That immediately will tell you you're pretty much working with an array. And then also you have class name, which is just a string representation of the class attribute, and you just have a ton of information here. I couldn't even go through all of this with you, but all of that information is there so that your JavaScript files can gain access to all the last little piece of information about your DOM elements. And it can manipulate these values, and then once it manipulates the values, it will actually re-render it out in the DOM. For example, you have the inner HTML. Well, you might want to actually change that inner HTML, which don't forget, we're talking about the body element, and inside of there we have the div element with the ID of hello. That's the inner HTML. And likewise, we have the inner text. Well, at the moment, there is actually no text there. So inner HTML will render the HTML within that element, but it won't render any text. The text needs to actually be visible to the user. And then on top of that, we also have a whole host of other information, and you can even see all of the event listeners attached to that DOM element. For example, if I was to, let's have on key press. So let's say I'm on the body element, this is in focus, and I just, press a key like the enter key or whatever. Well, if that was the case, then the on key press event will fire. Now at the moment it's null, which means that nothing will happen. But if I had a function here, that function would execute. So this is actually an event. Now we'll talk more about events later on, but you can always tell an event because it's got the on word in front. So on input, on has changed, on, and so forth. So they are all events that you can attach to this DOM element. Really nice, and it's a simple object notation of the DOM. And again, you can just keep going with this and just keep taking a look at all of this array of information that is available to you. You can look at the parent element, which don't forget is the HTML tag right there. So we have the body and then it goes to the HTML tags. And again, likewise, that's a DOM element. So I get all of this information again and again and again. And even what you can get is the CSS styles as well. So under the style property, you have essentially what is an object again. So you have a style object, and you can start manipulating the CSS of this DOM element. Very, very nice. So what I want you to take away from this lecture is that you have the DOM. The DOM and the CSS get loaded in, and JavaScript, the JIT-compiler, will automatically populate the document object. It will create a document object that is full of JavaScript objects, and those JavaScript objects resemble the elements within your HTML page. That's how JavaScript works with your DOM elements. You manipulate those objects in the document object, and then once you've manipulated them, the browser will immediately reinterpret it, or the JIT-compiler will say re-render the page, and it will re-render your DOM element on the page to either have different content in there. It could also have different styles. You could also attach event listeners and so on and so forth. Very nice, and we are going to discover more and more and more about this document object model and about objects themselves when it comes to the interpretation of the DOM in JavaScript.